Welcome to It's Not You, It's Grief, a safe space to have candid conversations surrounding the many faces of grief. How do you handle the process while moving forward and ultimately getting back to living in the moment? Come on this journey as we navigate grief through the art of storytelling. And now for your host, Ahira Smith.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to It's Not You, It's Grief podcast, episode 2. I just want to say before we get started into today's segment, thank you all so much for joining me on my first episode last week. I am so humbled by all the messages and the positive support that I've received about this. I've even received phone calls from some of my oldest and dearest friends who really am appreciative of this particular topic that, I am taking it upon myself to speak on something that truly impacts each and every one of us. So whether it is through the loss of a loved one, whether people have unfortunately lost their jobs or businesses, folks who are dealing with some issues in terms of their health, dealing with illnesses, even those who are no longer in relationships, marriages are being dissolved, separations, or just no longer together with your significant other. Grief plays a part in each one of those components. And I think it's important that we make sure we acknowledge that, because sometimes it can be hard to recognize it, but we acknowledge that grief is very much part of the process of healing and being able to move forward with it so we can get back to living in the moment. And I really am hoping that these stories that are shared, not only from me, but those who may come on this podcast will be able to resonate with other people who are currently going through grief. And they're able to have conversations with their loved ones and be able to find the type of support that they need to get through their grief. Now, please understand, it is a process. As I told you all last week, there is no blueprint to this. None. So the way you grieve is the way you grieve. However, it doesn't mean you have to be alone in the process. So if nothing else, if all you get out of it was just the decision to do something about it, to get the help that you may need, talking to a professional therapist, to be able to start changing some habits that help you with the healing process, whether it's through physical, mental, social interaction. If anything of that comes out of this type of podcast, then that was the purpose of it all. I want to be able to help people through their own grief. And I'm very comfortable with it, as much as I have still going through my own grieving process, but I'm comfortable enough. I'm at a point in my life where I'm comfortable to be able to help other people find their own healing methods. Okay, so I just want to put that out there. And again, just to humbly say thank you so much for joining me on this journey. It doesn't end necessarily, but it doesn't mean you can't move forward with it and get back to living in the moment. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and focus on episode 2, which I have carefully called it. It is entitled My First Love. Now, I know everybody who's listening can think back about their first love. Now, for some of us, it may have to take a little bit more time to think about who that first love is. Now, and I'm talking about no first love of your celebrity crushes. I'm not talking about the Megan Goods, or I'm not talking about the Elvis Presley or the Sam Cooke or Marvin Gaye. And I'm sure all of those people were beautiful to you all when you were younger. New Edition, I get it. But I'm talking about your first love, your first relationship that you were able to say, write a letter. Do you like me? Check yes, check no. Those type of relationships, and passing those notes along in the classroom without the the teacher catching on to what's happening. I'm talking about those types of relationships. I'm talking about the ones that may have started in middle school or even high school. And for those of you who may still be with your first love, whether it's on any level like that, God bless you, because that just means that everything that you guys have gone through to this point has done nothing but giving you the strength to continue on being together through all the trials and tribulations that life was going to throw your way. So that's a beautiful thing, you know. However, for those of us who are not as fortunate to be with their first love, for whatever the reason may be, you know, this is a time where I just kind of want us to talk about, you know, what grief looked like when things were not going that way. You know, when things didn't have a rainbow at the end of the story itself. You know, when there wasn't a pot of gold. You know, because again, relationships do come and go, and then when it's your first love, and if you're still not in that relationship, that shit hurts. I'll be honest with you. That hurt. It had to hurt because you opened yourself up. You were vulnerable. You were you were opening your heart to somebody that you were getting to know, and vice versa. So I expect it to hurt. Now let me just put a little pin real quick. Just for those who are new to this podcast, every now and then I may let a word that is a little explicit come out, but again, it's just a moment. So please don't hold that against me per se. I'm one of those things where I'm going to try to be as authentic as much as I possibly can through this process of talking with you all. At the same time, it's going to be organic, so it's going to be all over the place. So I just want to make sure, and if whatever I say that you don't necessarily like or resonate with you, agree with you, I apologize ahead of time, but I'm just going to keep it 100. I tell people what they need to hear and not necessarily what they want to hear. But I just want to be authentic in terms of the art of storytelling, especially about when it comes to certain things of this nature. So I'm going to put the pin back up. All right. So again, with relationships, it comes and goes. I mean, I know for me, my parents were married for a number of years before they ended up separating and getting a divorce. And let me tell you something, the amount of grief that fell on both my parents' plate was clearly evident. And I don't mean just by witnessing it and hearing it from their own mouth, but just their actions. What they did told so much, more than what their words could have ever said. And through it all, even up to the point where both my parents are no longer with us, they passed away a few years ago. My dad still very much loved my mom, and my mom very much loved my dad, even though they couldn't be together. But the grief was still there. And I really don't think that they ever had a chance to heal from that grief, because of the simple fact, I think a lot of that had to do with the fact of their upbringing and the generation that they came from. My parents were part of the silent generation. So they were born in 1941. So, a lot of times when you're dealing with grief, you don't talk about stuff like that. Even the baby boomers and even my generation of Gen Xers, we don't talk about grief. It's nowadays you just lucky to have a bereavement day of 3 days if somebody passes away. Some jobs they give you 3 days, and some jobs don't even give you that much time to grieve a loss. So if that's what the time frame is of somebody who's passed on, who's made a transition, if that's all people give folks in terms of dealing with the bereavement, what type of time frame is it when you lose your first love or your relationship is broken up? And as I told you before, there is no timetable with this. People can still go to work. People can still do the everyday normal routines, but that doesn't mean that they're not grieving. They're just going with emotion, And so for me, I know that's what I did with my first love. I was with my first love for 8 years. Now, for some people, that's longer than than some people who've been in relationships combined, especially if they have multiple relationships. But I was truly with my first love for 8 years. And in my mind, back in 94, I was like, oh, this is going to be my first love. He's going to be my first, my last, and my only. I already had it in my mind. I was going to marry this man. You couldn't tell me nothing. I mean, Michael, which was his name, he was a sophomore and I was a freshman, and I was drawn to his intellect and his charisma, and he's funny, and he was just a big man on campus, and not only in stature but just his overall personality. There wasn't anybody on my campus at the time who did not know who Big Mike was, or as people affectionately called him, Jenkins, because that was his last name, Michael Jenkins. And so, for me, one of the things I loved about him was his love for history. He was a history major at Kentucky State University, and I couldn't stand history. I hated it. I thought it was boring. I didn't like none of the stories. I didn't want to even deal with it. But as a requirement for me to complete my degree, I had to do history. And he ended up being my tutor. How convenient is that? And by the time he was able to tell me the story and tell me the history contents in the art of storytelling the way he did it, I fell in love with history, and it made me love him even more. I mean, even to this day, I still will watch a documentary that talks about the pharaohs of Egypt, or something that took place in World War II. And I really do believe that is in part because of what he shared with me. He shared me something of his that he was very passionate about in his first love, and it just resonated with me to now where I'm doing that. So, but my first love with Michael Jenkins was just great. I learned a lot on not only of who he was, but more importantly, I learned a lot about myself. I never had a relationship before I came to Kentucky State University. Let me be clear. I did not have a relationship before Kentucky State University. Why? You can thank my father for that. My father did not allow me to date. Okay. I wasn't allowed to date. The guys at my school in high school, they were not only intimidated by my older brothers, where we all went to the same high school. They were intimidated by my older brothers, but they were even more intimidated by my father. So my dad never had to worry about some guy calling the house or anything, because it wasn't going to happen on none of their watches. Even when they graduated, and my brothers and I were all 4 years apart, they still wouldn't talk to me, because at the end of the day, they knew who my brothers were and my dad. So thanks, Pop. You way to cop block my dating scene in high school. But I had college, so I was able to go ahead and start dating when I was in college. And Michael and I were together for a number of years. And unfortunately, some stuff had taken place to where we had to break up. Some mistakes were made, and I didn't recognize it at that time. I just figured it was just, it's what couples do. They fight, they argue, they break up, and they'll eventually make up. Break up just to make up is what we do. That song that's out there. But at that time, when we were no longer together, I was going through grief. I was going through grief because I missed my first love. I missed talking to him. I missed spending time with him. I missed the debates. I just missed him, and I missed who I was when I was with him. And so I was going through a grieving process in itself, because I'm like, I don't know what to do now. This was my first boyfriend. In my mind, I was going to be with him forever, but that wasn't the case. And so I had to swallow as much as I could with my pride, and I just had to put it out of my mind. I had to just out of sight, out of mind. It was kind of hard to do that when you're on such a small campus, but nevertheless, I had to do that because I had to get focused on my studies. And, time went by, and eventually we did get back together while we were on campus and back in school. But things did change. I was no longer the naive person. And in part because of it, because of what happened, there was sides about me that developed out of it, that I didn't even recognize myself. I started to not trust people. I started to question things that he was doing, or why should I do this, and all of that. It was an ugly side that did not really resonate with me, or at least at the time I didn't understand why it did. But nevertheless, it was just part of the lessons that needed to be learned through that relationship. And so we did get back together, and he graduated first, and then he went on to be a professional teacher, because that's what he went to school to do. He wanted to be a teacher, and that's exactly what he became. He became a great teacher back in Louisville, in his hometown. He was a mentor. He inspired his students to be great, both in the classroom and out of the classroom. He was a football coach. He was a step master. For those of you who might not know what that is, that's a person who at a high school level was somebody who taught kids how to step. Because he was part of the greatest fraternity out there, Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated. Shout out to my brothers, who, it was one of those things where he was giving them tools and knowledge on things, on how to be a better person, especially for the young men in his area. So all these things that he was showing to other people, I loved that about him. And I was drawn to that because, again, it inspired me to be better. He not only helped me with something as little as being a great and acing my history, to want to be inspired and give back to the community, and speak up for those who can't talk for themselves. I love that about him. He was passionate about helping others, because one thing I really understand and hold to this day is that I did not get where I am without somebody helping me behind the scenes. Nothing I do today has any, I did not do this by myself. It was definitely by that of the Creator and those who he surrounded me by, to push me and put me in situations that helped me become a better, stronger person. And that's what I loved about him so much. And so we were together, and it was a time when I was about to graduate, and I had this great opportunity to get my master's degree, because I was ready. I wanted to get married, but I was like, you know what, let me get my master's degree. And then after I get my master's degree, then I'm going to come back and we're going to get married, and then we're going to just live our lives out. We're going to do it. And that was the plan. However, God had a different type of plan for me. And unfortunately, we broke up again for the second time, because there's just some things that were not in alignment to what I was trying to do and what he was doing. And eventually we did break up, and it was very hard for me to handle that, being away. I was away from him for 4 hours. I couldn't see him as much as I wanted to, because I had to focus on my studies. And not only that, through the time that I graduated in 2000 to 2021, so within like a year's time, I broke up with my grandmother had passed away. So there's another element of grief that was on me. My relationship with my first love had ended again for the second time. I'm still grieving over my grandmother's loss. Now I'm losing my first love here, who can't be there with me because of distance and for other reasons. And then shortly thereafter, my grandfather passed away. So I had grief on top of grief on top of grief. Now, what does that mean? I was going through hell. I was struggling. And at the time, again, I was only taught to just focus on your studies. You can't worry about anything you have no control over. Just focus on your studies. So what did I do? I suppressed it. I just kept busy. But in the midst of me suppressing it, I started to get depressed. Depression is very interchangeable with that of grief. And for me, it was something that I did not I knew why I was depressed, but I did not know that the element of grief was part of that as well. Back then, I just knew I had to do what I needed to do in order to make sure I finished my degree in a timely manner, because that was the goal. Otherwise, why did I make the decision that I made to be so far away and for all this to happen? I needed to come out with something, even if it's just my dignity and a degree. So I ended up doing that. But The thing that I really was able to gather from that whole type of experience is that even though we weren't together, and I knew we weren't ever going to really be back together because by that time he had already moved on. He actually was about to start a family with somebody else. And hearing that type of news, that also compounded more of my grief, because in my mind, again, I thought he was going to be my first, my last, and my only. I wanted to be the mother of his children, but when somebody else beat me to it, you couldn't tell me nothing. I was struggling with that. And we had to part ways. But after a few years had passed, I was able to find some solace in the whole idea of it. It's times like that when you really understand um that things happen for a reason. And even looking back on it now, God knew what He was doing for the both of us. He knew exactly what we were, what he would. He knew exactly what He was doing in regards to us. And so we both went our separate ways. He ended up being in another relationship. He even got married. And I ended up being in other relationships and moving forward with my career. And it wasn't until about maybe 10 years ago or so, 10 plus years ago, we were able to kind of reconnect. And I was in a different place in my life. I was in a different headspace, and I was like, you know what, I got love for you, brother. What's done is done. I forgive you. It is water under the bridge. And I know for a fact that he loved me too. He told me many times that the way things ended between he and I, it resonated with him so much that he was very sorry. However, I do believe that had the decisions that were made, had they not taken place, neither one of us would have been where we needed to be. And so, here is this man who went to my first love, to a great love of mine, when I was a young girl. And he became, I loved him as my classmate. I loved him as a member of my fraternity brother. I loved him as a brother in Christ. I loved him because he was just Mike. As he was one of my oldest and dearest friends, and I so do appreciate it. All of the lessons he gave me, to be the woman that I am today. And again, throughout all of it, I didn't recognize then until just recently that though the hardships that I had faced in the relationship with my first love did incorporate that of grief, I have a better understanding as to what that means now, in terms of not only how I handle that relationship, but how I will handle my relationships going forward. And I definitely have taken some of those lessons and made sure that they were very much still with me to this day, whoever I interacted with. So, with that being said, fast forward to maybe a couple of years ago on 2021. Make a long story short, Michael was one of those people who had a very big heart, and yet at the same time, he had some health issues, and it's unfortunate that those health issues had caught up with him. In the August of 2020, um, he had suffered a major health setback to the point where he had to be in the hospital and even had to get a leg amputated. And it was heartbreaking to hear that, because I just remember him being such a big man on campus, that he was just he was an athlete. So for me to hear that about him, happening to him, I had no words. And so in March of 21, actually March 12th, on this date, 2021, I got a phone call that basically told me that he had passed away. So my first love, Michael A. Jenkins Jr., had passed away at the age of 45. And one of the more recent times that I remember he and I getting together was when he showed up at my father's funeral, almost 2 years, almost 3 years to the date. He showed up to my dad's funeral, even though his health wasn't good. He showed up for me, and I'll never forget that about him. He showed up, um, and it was he just showed up, and it was what I needed. And so it took me a few days to speak on the passing of him. And what I did is I wrote a post, and I'd like to just read that to you all now and just kind of give you an idea of what Michael was. So, a good man will love you for all the things he appreciates about you. However, a magnificent man will love you for all the things that you struggle to appreciate yourself. That poem is by G.R. White. This man, Michael, represented the West End of Louisville, Kentucky as a proud high school graduate of Central High School in Louisville, who went on to become a distinguished graduate of both the Kentucky State University and Indiana University in the field of education. This man had a gift for storytelling, whether it was about philosophy, politics, history, especially African American history, hip hop music, activism, sports. He would be able to capture folks' minds for hours at a time with his words and thought process in terms of breaking things down to the simplest forms, only to help you reconnect the dots to understand it even better. He was like no one I have ever met when we were first introduced back in 94. He taught me a lot about myself during those early years and guided me through some real challenging moments. He helped me think outside of the box. In fact, it was more along the lines of a hexagon. He just had that many sides of him. Michael taught me how to appreciate what life has to offer and what it has yet to offer and show me down the road. I remember his passion. I remember his innovative ideas. I remember his persuasive manner, his sacrifice to help others, his faith, and above all, his love for his family, his siblings, especially his daughter, for even his former students, classmates, just his community. By no means he was perfect. In fact, he was made beautifully imperfect, yet despite those imperfections, he still made lasting impression on those who were blessed to come in contact with him. So with that, I say thank you, Michael, for allowing me to be part of your journey while you're here on earth. Thank you for the valuable lessons that have shaped me into the woman that I have become while I'm still on this walk. Thank you for being my protector, for showing me how to love myself, even if that meant to part ways only to reconnect years later as friends and as members of the same community. I know that you're at peace, and that's a beautiful feeling to have these days. I know God knew what he was doing when he brought you into my life. Michael, I love you. And until we meet again, Ashe. So that was my first love. And I am very blessed and fortunate that he's still watching over me. I believe in my heart he's watching over me. I got another guardian protector up there along with my mom and my dad and some of my other family members and close angels that's got my back. I'll be honest with you. I don't even know if I really truly grieve. Finish. I don't know how much I've grieved for him because I think since the time that my parents had passed on, I've just been in a state of grief. But I'm learning a little bit more each day about myself on how to move forward with it, and again get back to living in the moment. And again, I really hope and pray that regardless of who your first love might have been, and you might be on your fifth love, I don't know. Whenever situations do not come about the way you want them to be, and it may cause grief in your life, I hope it is temporary to the point where you are able to start the healing process and move forward with it. We only have one life to live. And I know for me, that I want to make sure every moment, every second counts, because things do change from one minute to the next. And so with that, I want to say thank you again for joining me on my storytelling of my first love. By all means, please come back next week where we'll talk a little bit more about grief and the art of storytelling and how it heals through different facets of grief. With that being said, be well, take care, and until next time, peace and blessings.
Thank you for listening, being intentional, and sharing this moment with us. We at It's Not You, It's Grief deeply understand the many facets of grieving, and we want to make sure we can be here for you. Again, thank you for listening, and tune in again wherever you subscribe to podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time. Be well.